Hey guys, welcome Adam, welcome Mike, welcome Shamsad, welcome to this community event. Today I'm very happy to have Aadil Maan with us, who is a senior engineering program manager at Humane. Welcome Aadil.
Hey everybody, how's it going? It's either very early somewhere or very late somewhere. So good morning and good evening to everybody.
Exactly. We should start maybe with this. Good morning and good evening, everybody. Feels great. So I have the first thing I want to say is that Adil and I have known each other because of our respective writing, right? So I write refactoring, Adil writes building Roams, that is another newsletter focused on technical program management. And even though we do not chat face to face very often, I feel like I have known Adil for a long time now, thanks to his writing. And I even got back to my email client and checked when I subscribed to your newsletter, Adil, and it was November 2020. It was just 2 months after I started refactoring. So it's 2 years and a half ago or something. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and
So
look at you. You're like leaps and bounds ahead of me. I like sputtered and gave up halfway because I was like, I have nothing to say. And then every week, Luca just kept writing crazy and more content. And look at this, he's built a community now. For me, he's like
yeah.
the ultimate inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Adil. I really loved your newsletter. I mean, I've taken a lot of inspiration over time. Yeah, I feel you're not being generous enough for yourself because you're pushing a lot of content in a very niche space. So it's very hard to push content week after week for technical program managers, but we'll get back to that. So as I told you before, I feel that primarily this event is first and foremost an excuse for me to catch up with you and chat a little bit, but I will introduce you anyway for people who do not know you and don't know your story. And so basically, as you all can see, even though Adil is still quite young, he has had an incredible career so far. He has worked with many of the most successful tech companies out there, including Apple, Google, Nike, Research in Motion, so BlackBerry in the past, and now, of course, Humane. Most times as a program manager, so technical program manager, engineering program manager. That is a role that sometimes need to be explained, to demystify to people, especially those in small startup or mid-sized companies that are not familiar with that. So my first question for Adil would be, what is exactly a TPM or technical product manager, and how is it different from the other PMs? So product manager or project manager or even an engineering manager?
I'll tell you the funny answer, then I'll tell you the serious answer. We're project managers with enough technical knowledge that we can annoy the shit out of engineers. That's the thing.
That's a fantastic answer.
We're dangerous enough that when we come up with shit, it's usually backed with some experience because we know slightly what we're talking about. No, the textbook definition of this, and this is something that I also tried to demystify as much as I possibly can, because you're right, outside of Silicon Valley, even while I was working at BlackBerry, we were not called technical program managers. We were that traditional project specialists, project coordinators, and that kind of a ladder. Technical program manager is anybody who is driving very large, cross-functional, complex technical programs. When I talk about programs, it's a number of projects coming together, often in a shape of a release or in a shape of a overall grand strategy, whether that's like a 2-year roadmap or a next big thing like we used to have at Nike, where we would do these initiatives like this year is going to be all about more Nike membership and how do we increase that. And that hits across multiple work streams, both technical, business, marketing, operations, and things like that. So for TPMs, our job is always floating at that 10,000 foot level and trying to figure out where the risks are, managing those risks, and then diving into the 100-foot level to resolve and work with engineering, product design to address a specific roadblock that's blocking progress or causing schedule delays.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it makes me think about when you hear the most common advice about team organization and structuring teams, you always hear about you create small teams like 2 pizza teams, you make independent teams that work in isolation on stuff. But then sometimes, especially with large companies, this is like wishful thinking, right? There are, even if you create small teams, you have large projects and large deliveries, and you have to likely coordinate the
Mhm.
work of many of such small teams, if you even if you manage to create many of them who theoretically should be independent, right? So you need other people and other teams of people who just make sure that things go along a plan that has been made.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have to learn to appreciate is that any sort of methodology or framework exists with a promise that we're going to get rid of things for you so that we can speed things
Yeah,
up. And one of the things that I have learned and come to appreciate is the fact that as companies grow, by nature, silos will form. And you cannot get rid of those silos because every engineering team at a certain size and scale will demand autonomy. They want
yeah,
control over their own roadmap, they want control over their own vision. And you cannot get rid of those silos. You cannot be like, now we have removed all boundaries and now you're all one big happy team, right?
yeah,
If you think about a security engineering organization versus a mobile front end team versus an infrastructure team versus a cloud team, right? They all
yeah,
independently have their own backlogs or roadmaps that they're working with, and it's constant negotiation between the two. So what you're trying to strive for is, as the growth goes, is to make those silos a little softer. And the way
yeah,
you make those silos softer is enough permutation between them to let information flow back and forth so that you
mm,
can bring large teams together to drive insanely large visions to fruition, whether that's bringing new experiences to productions and or updating existing permission or experiences, or something as simple as, hey, we're going to move from AWS to P, right? There's a
yeah,
lot of new pieces that happen. You could be like, okay, the engineering leader is responsible for driving all the program coordination and all that stuff. Or you could have them actually focus with the engineers to figure out what the technical solution needs to be, addressing roadmap, like roadblockers and things like that. And that's when the value of the TPM really comes in. And that's why you see them at large
yeah,
corporations, particularly like Apple and Google, because it's the need, it's an opportunity cost at that time.
yeah. It's really interesting. While you were speaking about silos, I was thinking that basically every characteristic or quality of an engineering team can be depicted as good or bad depending on the situation. I mean, you have autonomy, which can be described as a very good thing, but then sometimes we talk of silos, which are about autonomy, right? But that they're like the bad angle of autonomy. And at the same time, collaboration looks like a good thing, but then you get dependencies between teams, and that's like a bad angle. It seems like a bad word. So is it like that TPMs just, I mean, you don't have direct reports. It's not like you have your own team of engineers. You just come in at the right time to help teams work together. So you jump in a situation and coordination between different teams.
Yeah, and I think that's the most hardest part about a TPM, particularly for new people, is that recognition. I think a lot of engineers who transition into this role struggle with this, that I
Yeah,
have seen in my experience, where they're assuming that, okay, I may no longer be coding, but clearly I am technical enough that I can make decisions. And that will depend on the culture of the organization. A lot of TPMs, depending on what their position is, I've heard at Meta, I've seen at
mm,
Google, TPMs will have a very outsized say in the
mm,
conversation, but ultimately they're not the ones making the decision. So we're
yeah,
known as leaders without authority. We have no formal
yes,
authority. There are different career tracks that you can take where you eventually become a people manager for TPMs or continue to be like an individual contributor. But ultimately, you're right. We are not. And I think this is the part that scares most engineers when they hear the word project management, is they assume somebody's just going to come tell them what to work on, which I'm not sure where that started from, because I can tell you project managers can't tell you to do shit. Like, all we can tell you is, please, this is a risk we should look at. And I think this is where the TPMs are dangerous enough that we can come with the context and details of, look, if we don't have this API up by this time, this means that the client teams can't adapt this. This means that this will have this consequence in the further. If this slips the entire schedule, we're talking about marketing announcement delays. We're talking about this. Like,
Yes.
we look at the whole thing, and yeah, it gets crazy. And part of that is influence. We leverage our soft skill knowledge to push people towards the right thing. And somebody very smart said to me a couple of weeks back is that, and sometimes those engineers will not do what you want to do, and you have to be okay with that. Or they may do something that may not be 100% the way you've done it, but as long as the outcome is there, it doesn't matter. And I think a lot of new TPMs struggle with that weird accountability without power.
Mm. Yes, I can feel in your words. I mean, it has to be hard. I have no experience either, of course, as a TPM or working with TPMs, but jumping in a team where you're not really the manager of anybody, with people already busy with their own work, with their own managers, their own stuff. You're basically accountable, and the person who is responsible for the general planning and organization of the work. While you were talking, I was thinking about planning itself, right? Because you do obviously a lot of planning, a lot of coordination, and you know that in software these days, planning is controversial topic. Because on one side, you have all these agile preaching that says you have to be reactive to change, you have to be you always have to adapt to reality. So it is not worthwhile, or at least that is what many people understand, to make all these long-term plans about what has to be built. But on the other side, of course, you have all these examples of incredible products and feats in engineering from the past, for example, from companies like Apple, that are, of course, the result of multi-year meticulous planning, so many moving parts coming together. So my question for you is there something like good planning and the bad planning, or the good and the bad angle? What are the best lessons that you have learned about how to plan things properly without making stuff rigid or not adaptive enough of what can happen?
Yeah, so I started my career at BlackBerry working on smartphones. And you know that when you're building a hardware product, you have to be rigid with your planning because there are
Yes.
very precise milestones that you have to hit. You're in Proto 1, then you go to Proto 2. Do we do an EVT? Do we do an EVT2? Do we do DVT, PVT, mass production? And each one of those has a certain criteria that the software needs to be at a certain stage, right? So
Yeah.
you have no choice but to be in this weird, rigid waterfall process. Okay, we need to have this, we need to have this, we need to have this by this time. And if anything slips, you move that entire thing. It's very different, right? Where one resistor or capacitor change on a hardware side means 7 to 8 weeks of delay. A one-line change is like the most famous thing, right? Oh yeah, it's a one-line change. We'll
Yeah.
get that in and have that out in 30 seconds, depending on how your CI/CD is set up, right? But I have struggled with this. And one of the things that I think the best advice that I ever got as an individual was from Chris Espinoza, who was employee number 9 at Apple. And he still works there, by the way. Happy to always, if you all ever find yourself working at Apple, you just hit him up and he will happily have a coffee chat with you. He told me that the best advice he gave me was never deal in absolutes. That includes whether it's frameworks, methodologies, any of that stuff. So when people come to me with, hey, you're being too rigid with your planning, you're being too strict with, we need to figure out all these requirements and things like that. By the way, this conversation is going to get weird and philosophical, so it will not make sense in many cases, but trust
I'm
me,
ready for that.
it makes sense in my head. I think the best way to look at planning is what keeps the forward momentum going. There is a certain amount of certainty you can have that allows you to keep pushing. And that's not an MVP. It's about, what do I need to do for the next 2 weeks, for the next 4 weeks? Where do I see the program going in the next 6 weeks, in the next quarter, depending on how long the program is? And along the way, you're continuously just checking in on the overall level of uncertainty, right? There's this model of cone of uncertainty.
Yes.
I think if you're traveling along that cone, you will know that the closer you get to the deadline, the more certainty you should start to have. And if that's not happening, that means that your planning was not good enough from the very start. In a waterfall world, we will be like, can we throw more bodies at this? Let's just throw more people at it. Maybe we can go make it faster. And I think in the Agile world, where oftentimes people, in my opinion, confuse this, is it's okay to have a certain number of things not be finalized. But that does not also mean that you can just lunge into a program with 80% of your things not figured. You have to have at least one full happy use case figured out, and then you can go work on it. You cannot be like, oh, I figured out 20% of the happy use case, let's start coding. That's, I think, the most common misconception in what Agile is driving, because you're like, oh yeah, we have 50 sprints to go through. We'll figure this out along the way. No, that's not how it works. That's how you paint yourself in a corner. Yeah.
I think it's a very valid point, because I do not exactly feel that Agile had this kind of message, but I think it's so easy to misinterpret some of these values as going in that direction. And I love your definition about planning being what enables momentum to keep going. So I was thinking while we were talking that it's like you want probably to have, let's call it, the minimum viable planning all the times, which just happens to be different for companies of different sizes, programs of different sizes. This kind of planning for keeping this momentum for a small team just happens to be much smaller than what needs to be done for keeping the momentum of teams having to work together to ship something that is complex, that is many months from now. So it's just a byproduct of that. It's just that you cannot say planning and it's the same for everybody, probably.
You just gave me the title for my next post, Minimum Viable Planning, because I think that is phenomenal. I've been trying to there we go, minimum viable planning. Like, I think there is absolutely a level of minimum viable. This is why Luca and I get along so well. It's like, without even realizing, we're like writing each other's newsletters.
The return on investment of this call is already like over the top.
I love
it.
I think there is a level of minimum viable planning, and it will matter differently for every single company. And one of the things that I think culturally companies need to do, the best way to shut down a conversation about when somebody's asking very specific questions about planning is, hey, I get it, you're asking me these questions, but we don't do waterfall, we do agile. That immediately tells me two things. One, you have no freaking idea the answer to my question, and absolutely that answer is going to become a risk later on because you're pushing that bucket down the hill. And that's when I dig in more into that question of, okay, no, now we're going to solve this thing because this is putting all my red flags up, right? And what that minimum viable planning is, how far can I push my momentum? Do I have enough figured out that I can push 4 weeks out of it, a sprint cycle, 6 sprint cycles, 8 sprint cycles? Yeah. But ultimately, I don't think it's appropriate to launch into a project until you know that the final outcome you want is this. And then you start to figure out working backwards of what your happy paths are, what your flows are. And then as you progress through the program, certain unknowns will appear. And the point of Agile, which differs from Waterfall, is that when an unknown appears, you don't throw your hands up in the air and say, oh my God, what do we do with this? What about our project scope? It's take a look at this. Maybe this is a P0 blocker for us, or maybe this is a nice to have and we can punt it off as tech debt into the next release. That's the ultimate mission of Agile. And I always laugh when I read these articles of Agile must die, Agile must end, and we must end Agile. I'm like, no, I think Agile is just here forever. It's not a methodology, it's not a framework. It's this philosophy that it's okay to respond when you encounter something that you never planned for. That was the whole point. And James Shore, in his book, The Art of Agile, talks about this, where Agile was a response to the response of Waterfall, where leaders were not able to control every aspect of it, so they introduced Waterfall, where every process was controlled. And in response to that response of control, Agile came to be, because the opposite response to that was, we want iterative process so that we don't have to do this constant like massive control, and we can figure
Yeah.
things out as we go.
Makes a lot of sense. And I agree with you that when you get into these kinds of conversations with engineers where people bring up this and say, hey, we are not doing waterfall here, we need to do agile. It feels like these concepts are so broad and convey so little meaning these days that it's just not a fruitful conversation. Let's talk about what this means in practice. Otherwise, I'm not sure we are talking about the same thing. And maybe
Yep.
what I mean by waterfall is not the same that you're talking about, or agile for whatever it's worth. It's the same. I mean, what do you mean with that? Totally. So, well, another topic that comes to my mind, which is very related to planning, is that of estimates, right? So,
Mm.
create plans. You have to estimate effort and times or whatever you like about what needs to be done. And that is equally controversial, probably, if not more, especially in software, especially in engineers. So I was wondering, how do you work with engineers with estimating software, estimating the effort that it takes to create something? Yeah, I think this is also something where there is good estimates, estimates used for good,
Yeah.
estimates used for bad. So what's your take on this?
So I'm very anti-estimates. I think the worst thing we probably did was introduce the concept of story points into software engineering because it has done more to create confusion than clarity. For me, I have found it that engineers are better and more productive at shooting at a defined target than actually defining what that target needs to be, where you take a bunch of estimates and then figure out when it needs to land. And this was
Mm,
something that I learned at Apple was we defined the entire software schedule at the beginning of the release, and we said this is when we will ship the iOS release. And then all the way back, there were certain gates that we had to exit. Development happened at this time. Our first big check was WWDC, when we would announce to the world, here's what our iOS release looks like. Put that work back schedule there. And then you start asking engineers, what can you fit in these buckets? And it's not about estimates or stories or things like that. It's what will we have by this milestone? What will we have by this milestone? What will we have by this milestone? And that automatically puts you in this agile mindset of if we get closer to a certain milestone, your first question will always be is, maybe we have too much scope. Can we talk about redefining the scope? When you talk about estimates, you immediately get into the mindset of, okay, if an engineer is able to do 50 story points and in a week, that means that if I am late by a week, I add one more engineer, and then you start going to find contractors, and then you start adding more people, and the Brooks Law takes over and all that stuff. And it's, yeah, and particularly for 0 to 1, how do you estimate that? You have no frame of reference. If you were telling me that you're going to take a single mobile app and just make clones of it over and over again, I would be like, okay, sure. Over time, you've developed something that you can.
mhm.
I broke my own rule. I dealt in absolutes. I said I absolutely hate estimates, but that's not true. I think estimates have a place, but it shouldn't be what we place, the amount of pressure we place on engineers to give us estimates. I think it's
Yes.
more appropriate to give engineers targets to aim for. And this is the part of autonomy that I think engineers will always appreciate. And it runs counter to the zeitgeist of project managers will just come to me and ask me for an estimate and then go away. When you get to a target, you're constantly having this dialogue between your engineer of, hey, how's the progress? Where are we blocked? What are the risks? What do we need to look out for? Are we aiming for the right target? Is this target too optimistic, too conservative? Have we padded too much and things like that?
Yeah.
Estimates has a place. It is an initial gut check of do we know enough, but not in the sense of give me how many weeks this will take you to do. It's I want to be 0 bugs by this time, we want to bake by this time, and we want to ship by this time. Let's figure out what that work back schedule looks like. And I think I've written about this as well, and that started one of the somebody started a tweet thread on this. The person who owns like WordPress or Word WP, I don't remember. I dropped it on Lenny's community, and it like a lot of people had a lot of things to say. And one thing is for sure is that I think we're just all story point burned out, and
I love.
and a lot of that is because that what you talked about earlier, right? People get so hung up on framework and process.
Yes.
It's probably that some Scrum Master kept coming to the engineer and saying, hey, you don't have story points in your Jira tickets.
Yes. That's what
So,
happens, unfortunately.
yeah.
Yes.
And I'm not taking a dig on Scrum Masters. Please don't turn this into the 5-second TikTok that I'm famous.
Yeah, I will do exactly that. Adil throws shit at Scrum Masters in his interview. No, but I absolutely love going backwards from a deadline rather than creating estimates up front and then anyway trying to make things fit to a deadline, because most of the times what I found is that when leadership or management asks for estimates, they have some deadlines in mind. They have
Yeah.
some, I wouldn't even call deadlines, maybe time frames, okay, a scope of time where they want to see something. It's just that it is more productive to start with that and go backwards, trying to figure out what's the best scope.
Yeah.
It goes back to saying that basically you have two things to manage. One is the scope of work, and the other is the time frame. You cannot have both fixed. You
Yeah.
cannot fix both the scope and the time that it takes to do things. You can either fix that scope and keep the time flexible. So say, I want to do this anyway. So let's work in iterations and let's figure out how much it takes, but it's not applicable to all situations. Or you can say, I want to get something done in 6 months. I want to spend 6 months on this. What is it that I can get done? These are the most productive approaches that I've seen, at least.
Yeah. And I think what I advocate for any company that wants to be more agile or that's stepping away from a waterfall process or a more rigid process is don't dive into sprints right away. I want you to start thinking in releases. You have to figure out, like, and the reason why I say releases is because releases are like these self-contained bursts of energies that you can rally engineers around, and it's very different than sprints. What ends up happening is in sprint is that yes, you define your goals, yes, you say we're going to have all this stuff, but what ends up happening is that you will have this mad dash run all the way up until the very last minute of the sprint, and it leaves you no time for convergence. Yes, philosophically we say that, yeah, as you're coding, you're writing your tests, test-driven development and all that stuff, and quality is important and all that, but the reality is very different than what the academic view of the world is, and particularly software development. It's very uncertain, it's very ambiguous,
Yeah.
and suddenly you'll have a day where everything just clicks and you're like, we're going to code all this and then land it, and then you land it and it's blah, and then you
Yeah.
spend an entire next sprint just fixing things up.
Fix.
Releases have very specific milestones in between them. So think about it from this perspective. If you have a month-long release, right, you can say that a week before the launch, we're 0 bugs. That's the milestone. A week before that, we fix all the nice to haves, right? And the first couple of days of the release is left for planning and any conversations that you may need to have with like design, with business to figure out what we need to get done by each of these milestones, right?
Yeah.
I have found that when you give engineers, not sprints, a focused time boxed window and let them define what needs to go into that and give them very explicit points in that window of when you need to be pencils down so we can start testing and converging and quality and performance and everything like that, that is a huge game changer. And people will prefer that than constantly being in a room for 6 weeks and every 2 weeks saying, okay, what are we doing today? What user stories are we doing today? What's the sprint goal today? And that gives that sense of autonomy and control to the engineers as well, that, okay, we are masters of our own destinies. And if something breaks along the way, it's freaking agile. You talk about it. Do we reduce scope, increase scope, add more people, remove more people? What do we do?
That's great advice. And I think I know many teams who work with, as we said, backwards from a deadline, but I do not know many teams that then create checkpoints where, as you said, engineers pencil down. We need to have all P1s done
Yeah.
without bugs 2 weeks from release. Then we have nice to haves. That more granular level of deadlines and timeframes It's not something that I've seen often, especially in startups and in smaller companies. Maybe this is a lesson from larger companies, from like Apple or Google. Is this like they think about shipping even large projects? I think, right?
Yeah, so this is something I picked up from Apple because this was Apple's way of doing things. We had very specific milestones where we had to be like 0 bugs by this time. Otherwise, we would not be able to ship the iOS release. You have to converge, right?
Yes.
At some point, a program has to switch into convergence mode, and convergence mode is effectively you burning down. Your burn down has to be a downward trajectory. You're completing more work than either you have left or you are generating. And if that convergence graph after the middle point is not trending downwards, that's an alarm. And that's where every engineering leader needs to start asking questions of, okay, why aren't we converging? Is it because we have too much scope? Is it because we're not fixing things fast enough? It's a resourcing problem and things like that. It's a better question and a far better indicator than going up to your team and be like, how's it going? Are we on track? You gave me these estimates.
Yes.
Why aren't these estimates real?
Yeah. And do you think this approach works on all time frames? So let's say on a 3 months time scale, we would set the deadline, figure out the scope more or less even over time, and then we would set these checkpoints about when we need to start converging, fixing bugs, etc., etc. But in the work that gets done weekly or bi-weekly or whatever, or in a smaller time frame, how would you organize work? Do you think that is just a smaller version of this works just the same?
If you had asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said no. This vision probably works on a large yearly release cycle where you have very specific milestones along the way. But now I've got startup experience under my belt, and I can tell you it can work for any time frame. It all depends on what people are comfortable with. For me, I think the ideal time frame for a release should be 6 weeks, minimum 6 weeks. That's pretty much in line with what the Basecamp folks are talking about with their shape up experience. It's what I have seen, like even 2 week sprints. That's 3 2-week sprints coming together. Even if you spent like an entire week on planning in the first sprint, and then the rest of the 2 sprints or 2.5 sprints, you're doing engineering, and then you save the last portion of it for convergence and quality and performance. 6 week is that magical window. And I think even if you are doing sprints, 6 weeks, not 2 weeks.
That's very interesting advice. I've seen Mike nodding his head because I know he has worked with Shape Up many years.
I have so
with
many
the framework
questions for
from
Mike.
Base. I will bring him on stage later for questions and even for telling his experience. But I've seen, for what it's worth, talking with many startups, I've seen this happening more and more. It's a pushback from this radical approach of having smaller and smaller iterations. There are teams and product managers who are like pushing back and say, no, we just need more time to ship thoughtful things. It's not just about the fact that startups are uncertain, so we have to go week by week. That is a pure excuse. If you want to do great work, we need at least 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, but it's not either 1 or 2 weeks.
I think that there's an underlying assumption baked into 2 week sprints. You go into a 2 week sprint and all you will do for 2 weeks is code, when that's not the reality of things. That assumes that you have done a shit ton of work before you. This is where they talk about backlog grooming and constantly looking at your user stories and things like that. You can't do that. That's part of software development. Those very conversations are part of software development. And I think a 2 week sprint is nothing but an exercise in illusionment, that we have control, we know precisely what we're going to do for the next 2 week sprints. It breaks the entire agile model of being able to react fast enough. Now, granted, there will be many companies who will say, and experiences and teams that will say that 2 week sprints have been magical for us. Good for you. Keep doing what you're doing.
No problem. Yes, I agree.
But what I offer is, if you're one of those companies that have had a terrible experience with 2 week sprints, don't just abandon them. Try changing the length to 6 weeks and include planning and conversation and exercise. And for me, I think you always have to have a cool-off period between sprints as well, which is something that most people don't realize, is that That's context switching for a lot of leaders if you're doing planning during sprint cycle. You want people to be laser focused. So between each release, you should have at least a couple of days where you're talking about coming together and doing some planning. So turns out SAFE did actually give us something that's useful. It's not its entire thing, but the planning and program increments, it's not a bad thing. It just has to be changed around a little bit.
That's very interesting. So one thing I want to do now, since we are like 40 minutes in the event, want to bring in some questions from either Adam, Mike, or Shamsad or Mohammed. So feel free either to raise your hands if you can do that. So if you don't feel like if you don't find the way to do that, I just bring anyone on stage who wants to ask a question. If you write on chat, otherwise I also have more questions for Aadil, of course. Maybe I have to enable Q&A. Yes.
I think Adam's got his hand up.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Adam, bringing you on stage.
Nice. Okay, I'm part of the show now.
Yes.
That's a great feeling. Okay, so okay, working backwards. That's great. Really liked what I've heard. Is it different when you work with new teams who are just met or they assemble together, and you have team who have worked with each other for many months, many years? So of course there is a difference. So I would ask you about this first scenario, new team, new members of the team, and how to make sure that, let's say, this 6-month time frame is going to be delivered, because you will have to do more at the beginning of the project to make sure, okay, you plan backwards, but still. And I would ask you, as from your position, what questions can you ask to the team, how to make sure that the risk is not there? Of course, there is going to be the risk, but how to decrease that?
Yeah, damn, that's a solid question. I think let me address that culture part first. Even the most experienced teams that have been working together are liable to encounter a problem that may cause cracks within relationships, right? So the best way to bring a new team together that has never worked before as a unit is two things. One, you make them as part of the process as much as you possibly can. That includes actively having them involved in the planning process, actively having them involved in broader communications, bringing them together, giving them an opportunity to voice their opinions, and that the concept of psychological safety, and ensure that they have a voice. And over time, there's no shortcut to this. Over time, when they start to work together, they start to interact with each other, you'll start to see a gel form. And one of the places that I think is very underrated from a coaching perspective is look at their PR submissions and look at how the team is having conversations on PRs back and forth. A really good team, you'll see that it's a back and forth dialogue and an exchange of information. Like, okay, your PR, this particular line, I wouldn't do it this way. Have you considered doing it this way? What about this way? What about this way? The really bad team culture would be like, particularly between a senior and a junior engineer, the PR would go something like this. Senior engineer finds an issue, tells a junior engineer, this is crap. Here's a code I wrote for you. Copy and paste it into the PR, and then just submit. And the junior engineer would be like, looks good to me, because they're in awe of the senior engineer, right? So there's these tad small cultural things that you can do. So that's like how you bring the team together. And I think the other thing to focus on, if the team encounters a failure, whoever's the leader of that team, very quickly you have to ensure that it does not go into a finger-pointing blame game. And what we have is a blame-free root cause analysis at some point. And that shared consciousness will come together because you're having open and honest conversations where everybody has an opinion that has the opportunity to voice it, and it's actively listened to, and you're all working together and communicating across, and everybody feels like they're part of the team, and they feel like they're part of the process. They're not just being thrown stuff at. The second, I hope that answers the question. The second piece of the thing is there is a level of confidence. I think the minimum viable planning that, Luca, I'm definitely going to write something on that now. As the team lead, you and whoever you're working with, whether that's your PM or your design partner or whoever it is, you're constantly looking at that level of uncertainty. And any like experienced person will be able to figure out that, okay, that there is a level of certainty we have in certain flows, and that gives us an opportunity to keep making forward momentum. And one of the things that the milestones do is force you to pause and look at the work that you have done so far. Evaluate, did we miss anything in planning? Because now, think about it this way. You're at a point where you're like, okay, all the nice to have stuff is done. You can't do any more nice to have stuff. Only focus on the critical piece. That automatically shifts your mindset into thinking and looking at your scope of, if I had to ship this product tomorrow or this program or release tomorrow, do I have all my absolute requirements figured out and resolved? If not, that's an indicator that you're about to miss whatever that release milestone that you have set. So either you start to reduce that scope, or you start to figure out, can we push this out to the next release? And I think Fred Brooks talks about it in his book, that it's okay to delay, but delay only once, not constant delays. And that's when you get into the conversation with your PM and your design of, okay, if we slip this because we need to have these 5 different things and we've only done like 2 of them, what does that look like? And this is where a release will allow you to know that there's always a next window that I can tap into. And that was the culture at Apple, where if we missed a release, there was always something there next that we could jump on. There's always a train leaving the station. It's a lot different, I will admit, when it's a mission critical project where the life of a startup is dependent on this, or the project is going to create cash revenue and keep us alive for the next 6 months. In those very scenarios, it is okay to break the release cycle and say that, okay, we're going to push the release window out by a week, by 2 weeks, by 3 weeks. You don't know that in sprint cycles because you wait until the end of the sprint, because everybody's like mad dash all the way up until the end of the sprint, versus these releases where you have these gates. Nice to haves are done, absolute critical blockers are done. So how you ensure that you don't slip is minimum viable planning up front, constant checking along the way, and more than anything else, the psychological safety part that I mentioned earlier. Everybody should feel comfortable to raise their hand and say, red flag, this is not going to work. And I can guarantee you, the hallmark of very successful companies and teams that I've worked on is that raising that red flag, and the leadership coming together and asking, you estimated this, but instead of asking the more appropriate question of, okay, how do we fix this? That's the biggest question. And it has to be everything from reduced scope, more people, push the release out. I hope that answers your question. It's a bit of a word salad, in my opinion, now that I think about it.
Not an easy one.
I love the... No, please go on.
No, I was going to say, it goes back to my earlier comment, like, don't deal in absolutes. You have to be in the moment, do what makes sense.
I love the psychological safety angle and involving engineers and people on the team from day one. I think there is nothing worse than starting working on a project with engineers, starting to work on a plan that they do not feel like they own. They didn't really have the chance to give buy-in or to work on that, especially then if things go wrong. It's a very bad situation and you don't want to go there.
Yeah,
That's
and
advice.
If you think about it, how that translates tactically is that now you have these teams who are siloed off and they're like, just tell us when you need something. This is very typical between engineering and design. Engineers are never invited to the deep dive design conversations, particularly in big company, because the designers are afraid. They want free-flowing creativity, and engineers are just going to look at that and be like, yeah, we can't ship that. We can't ship that. We can't ship that. You're crazy, right?
Yeah.
And like, design is art. It's exploration. They will do 50 different things that they don't want to ship until they get to the one thing that they want to ship. And it takes time. And equally, engineering doesn't want design in the room because they're just going to look at that. That's not the spec. That's not the spec. That's not the spec. It's like, we're still in the engineering UI phase. What are you talking about? We'll get to your spec in a second. But if you can figure out a way where both of those teams can work together, oh my God, I have seen some of the most magical things happen because design and engineering figured out how to work together and give each other space to come up with these wild experiences. And Apple was really fantastic at doing that. And it was great. It was magical. It was wonderful. What you end up doing is, if you continue as these silos, is you've created these handoff points, which, if not managed, are the weakest links in your entire plan. And I promise you, nobody's paying attention to those handoff points because everybody's, oh yeah, if in design says that they will have a spec to us on the 9th of March, at 9 a.m. in the morning, I'm going to expect a fully fledged design spec. And if engineering says by the 10th, we will have all this implemented, that's what's going to happen, right? It sets these unrealistic expectations.
I love the. Thank you, Adam, for the question. So I will just remove you temporarily from stage, but if you have other question, you will jump back in. So this is like an incentive to have more questions. But I just want to add on this because I think you mentioned a great point about the collaboration between design and engineers, and I wanted your opinion on something, because in the best situations I've seen, those were, I would say, yes, created by some great processes in place, but also by individual people that were either product-minded engineers, design-oriented engineers, or designers who were more engineering-minded, that were able to bridge also this communication gap and manage to bridge these two spaces. So what's your experience with that? Do you need to educate these people or educate this kind of mindset? Or is it just a matter of creating a process where you have meetings, putting people together, and after a while things work?
So the thing about process, I think there's this weird confusion that we have that process is at best an illusion of control. It is not 100% control. You can't control human behavior. You can have the best process in place, but when things get tough, you can't stop somebody from being an asshole. It's just the nature of things. The best way to do that bridging is clear expectations. When you bring two of these teams together, let's say if you want to have a design and engineering brainstorming session, you tell the engineers, this is exploratory, these will not spawn into JIRA tickets, and you tell design that it's okay if engineers raise their hand and say this is not how the world works. It will help you be better designers and not ship something or create something that's completely unrealistic, right? And at the end of the day, you make it very clear, is this an exploration session? Is this a discussion? Is this a feedback and review? If it is an exploratory stuff, you as a TPM, if you're managing this, you let things run wild. You just control the emotions. You let them run wild. You don't mention schedule. You don't mention anything. If it is a design discussion where design is showing something, the best thing you can do for engineering is tell them that, look, listen, absorb, and tell design that we will come back to you if we have any questions. But in the moment, let design explain everything top to bottom and don't interrupt them, anything like that, because there's a flow, there's a narrative in design that you have to get. In a design review, one of the things that I have found very helpful is that if we're talking about reviewing a specific design spec, don't bring the engineers and be like, this is not going to work. Bring very specific questions about what aspect of the design, what particular flow, what button color, very precise about your question. Because much like lawyers, you have to be very careful with designers the way you ask the question. Because you cannot be like, this is not going to work, and the designer is going to be like, okay, I don't know what to do with this information. Okay, I'll go back to the drawing board and come up with something completely different. But if you tell them that the reason why this onboarding flow will not work is because the framework is not built the way that you think it is, these are the limitations and constraints that we have. That is far better knowledge and information that the designer can then take back and reevaluate what the onboarding flow looks like, versus saying, can't do the onboarding flow like this.
Yeah, I think this was very instructive, because basically what I got is that it's not enough to say to people, surprisingly, right? You just have to talk to each other, right? You have to facilitate the right kind of conversation, what people exchange when it comes to information, and how to make sure this stays productive. Otherwise, yes, you might be lucky, like that things go well anyway, or bringing people on all of you're in the same room might even do damage rather than help things.
Yeah.
Yes, that mirrors that. That's very interesting. I don't know if there are other questions, either from Mike or from Shamshad.
I've done my job.
Yes, you did it very right. We are almost wrapping up. So I have a final question for myself, Adil. I guess that one thing that enables good planning, good working together, especially when it comes to large teams coming together, is writing down stuff, right? And good documentation, good artifacts for these processes. And this is another topic that typically engineers run away from. Not many people like maintaining documentation or write down things for planning or for this designs for describing stuff. So mimicking the minimum viable planning success, what would you say it's like the minimum viable docs or artifacts
Yeah.
or tactics in that sense that enable good work in product engineering?
I think the most minimum viable thing that you can do is a very simple doc. If we're talking about release planning, right? Every release has things that are in scope and that are not in scope, right? And these are like broad things. The second is, what is the schedule that we're aiming for? What are our milestones? What are the teams that are involved in that? And who are the owners from those teams? Or what at Apple we used to call directly responsible individuals, DRIs. If you were to ask me, I don't care if you don't write an engineering spec. That's up to the engineers, because that will make their jobs complicated. Whatever they want to do, I will nudge them to write those specs. But me as a TPM, for every program that I work on, I will always have a doc or a wiki somewhere that will track these 5 things for that particular project. And I'm constantly updating that. And I will add things eventually as we start to figure out our work streams that link back to Jira epics or entire sets of epics and things like that. And those epics are something that I will use on a constant basis to check in, okay, how are we doing? Are we blocked and roadblockers and things like that? But the most powerful thing is the scope and not in scope, and the accountability piece of it. Which team is responsible for participating in this project or this program, and who are the people from that team that are working on this? So if I'm stuck on something, one, I know who I need to pull into a room to immediately talk about this. This is the part where TPMs are dangerous enough that they know who needs to be pulled into a room to discuss a particular technical problem. But more than anything else, that in-scope, out-of-scope conversation becomes a tool for us to communicate with leadership that this is what we're working on. If it's not in here, don't expect it to be there when we ship this. And if it needs to change, then let's talk about it. And that becomes a source of truth that everybody aligns on, that we're communicating on, and everything else. And the reason why I didn't say like schedule, because I think schedule, in my opinion, is very subjective to the day, the week, the phase of development that we're in. It's always very hard to know. It's good to have it there so people can reference it, but it may change. So for me, the minimum viable doc looks like what's in scope, what's out of scope, and who's working on from what team. That's it.
That's very practical and very precise. I think this is one of those areas where knowing what's not in the minimum viable docs is equally as much as important as what goes in. Otherwise, you get overwhelmed by doing Gantt charts and all kinds of stuff that then you have to maintain. So it drags you down, drags the more.
Yeah, it's my skinny PRD. That's what it is. It's my skinny PRD.
Yeah. Skinny PRD. I love that.
That's what I'm going to be famous for on TikTok, on Luca's shorts.
And minimal viable planning, probably.
Yeah. Ooh, Shamshad had a comment.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry that you're not able to mute yourself. I'm just reading out loud your comment. So just a comment that while Safe does account for all the pitfalls that Aadil is addressing, a TPM has to tailor a pragmatic approach that works for the people. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I think the final thing I will say about TPMs is that a great TPM as Shamshad said, we'll know when to stick to the rule book and when to completely throw it out and go with the flow
Yes.
of how things are. And this is where a release helps, because that gives them a target of, I need to get things done by this time, versus
Yes.
a sprint or a series of sprints where it's just cascading things of things that are happening. A release is very time boxed. It's very nice. It's very cozy in there. And you can take things and remove things and add it.
And I think that what gives you this ability of knowing when to stick to the rulebook and when to go free or go wild is to know in the first place why such rules exist and what the rulebook means, as opposed to just learning the rules like verbatim without knowing what's behind, which is unfortunately what many of us try to do, especially when we read books or even newsletters like
Yeah.
ours. You don't have to just stop at the superficial level, but trying to understand why things are like that, so you can tailor any framework or any rule to your team, to what your team needs, basically. So thank you so much, Adil, for this session. I love that, and thank you, Mike, Adam, and Shamshad for being here. I hope you enjoyed it, really.
Thanks, everybody. And Adam, thank you for that wonderful question, and Shamshad for that comment.
Thank you, guys. So we have recorded this. We will post it in the community. We will post it on YouTube, so you will be able to review all the session. We will likely also be able to extract notes about the main things that we discussed for a more easy enjoyment. So thank you all, and see you next time.